I'm very happy to be hosting Dr. Juliet Bates, artist, author, scholar, professor. We are very honored to have you with us this evening. And I also have a copy of Juliet Bates' book, The Colors, which I highly, highly recommend because it really is a great page turner. So I haven't finished reading it yet, but I've learned a lot so far. And I'm greatly enjoying it. Oh, I still need to admit some more people. Right. Okay. So a little about Dr. Juliet Bates. Dr. Juliet Bates was born in the northeast of England. After studying art and art history, she lectured in the UK and is currently teaching at the Ecole Supérieure d'Art et Médias de Caen, Cherbourg in France. Correct me, Juliet, if my pronunciation in French is a little awkward.
Don't worry.
In 2017, she completed a PhD in creative writing at the University of Manchester. Her debut novel, The Missing, was published by Linen Press in 2009, and her short stories have appeared in British and Canadian journals and magazines. Her second novel, The Colors, was published by Fleet in spring 2020. So this evening, Juliet Bates will be discussing notions of home and belonging in her new novel, The Colors, which is the one that I just showed you right now. So Juliet, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit more about me. Then I'm going to go on to explain briefly what the novel is about and why I wrote it. And then I'm going to move on to this theme, home and belonging. And I'm going to try and define what I mean by that and tease out a few points that I think are relevant to the colors. And then I'm going to read some extracts from the novel. And I think the whole thing is probably going to take me 45 minutes or so. So I just want to come back to a couple of things that Rula said about me that I think are kind of pertinent to what I write about. So I'm British, but I live in France, and I've lived in France for the last 20 years or so. And I guess even though I've spent so much time in France, I still feel very much of an outsider, although I think if I were in Britain, I would also feel like an outsider. But I'm very interested in that position of being on the margins of things. And I think a lot of my characters experience that same sort of distance. And certainly in the colors, that's the case for both of the characters, which I will talk about in a minute. The other thing that Rula mentioned is that I have a background in art and art history. And I realized when I was preparing this session that I have spent my entire adult life in art schools, either as a student or as a lecturer. And it's the place where I've learned to write, which is kind of ironic because in art schools, we deal with images and objects. But I think I've learned two things from spending so much time in art schools. One of them is looking, which is a skill which I think is very important for a writer, how to look. And I learned to look as a student through drawing, through observational drawing. And the second thing that I think I've learned from being in art schools is how to make something that doesn't exist. Which I think is the sort of thing that we do learn in art schools. It's the place where you learn to make something that doesn't exist. And you learn to make something exist by having a kind of process or a methodology. And one of the things that you need to do is to suspend that inner critic, to put the critic to bed, that horrible voice that keeps jabbering at you when you've just written something and you're reading it through. And suspending that voice, stopping that sort of intellectualizing process and just playing, I think is very important. And that's something that I've learned, actually not so much as a student, but more as a lecturer, watching students learn. that we need that time just to play with the materials. So playing with clay or playing with wood or paint, or in my case, playing with words. Those two things, I think, looking and making is something that I deal with quite a lot in the colors, not least because one of my characters is a painter and he becomes a lecturer later on in life, an art lecturer later on in life. And the other thing is that I think people are constantly looking in my novel. People are constantly looking at things. And if the novel has a mission, which it doesn't, but if it had a mission, I think it would be to incite people to look more closely and look obliquely at things and look at things from different points of view. Okay, so the novel, it came out last year in 2020 in April, so just at the point that the bookshops were shutting in the United Kingdom. So it's had a kind of virtual life up until now, which is why I'm pleased to be talking to you about it. It's a multi-generational novel, so it deals with two generations of the same family. And it's set in a small coastal town in the northeast of England. And as Rula said, it's where I come from. And I was particularly interested in, I wanted to write about two generations. In fact, I started out writing about 3 generations. But I wanted to write about 2 generations because I was interested in the way in which family history repeats itself. The way in which children seem to make the same choices or even the same mistakes as their parents, which is certainly the case in my family. I was also interested in themes of inheritance. So not just the idea of inheriting objects, but also inheriting illnesses, which is the case in the colors, but also ideas, and also myths about the family. And that's something that will become apparent when I read one of the extracts later on. The novel's set over a period of 60 years, so quite a long period. It starts in 1912 and it finishes in 1981. And it actually finishes on the day that Prince Charles marries Lady Diana Spencer. So it's sometime in July, I think. And I have to say, I particularly enjoyed writing that section. So it's, as I say, it's quite a long period of time. It's 60 years. And I was interested in the way in which the lives of these two fairly ordinary people, I mean, they're ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, of course, how their lives are played out against the backdrop of historic events, how much those events impact them or don't impact them. And obviously that takes in the 2 world wars. The novel centers on 2 characters, a mother and a son. And it's, I suppose, in many ways about their relationship or their non-relationship, because in fact they're estranged for most of the novel. So these 2 characters, one is called Ellen, she's the mother. The son is called Jack. And Ellen is a character who's born at the turn of the century. So when the novel starts, she's 12 years old. And in the first chapter, she is orphaned. Her education kind of stops, kind of comes to a halt, and she eventually goes into service. So she comes from a fairly ordinary working class family and lives effectively what is a fairly ordinary life, except that she has synesthesia, hence the title of the book, The Colours. So for Ellen, colours are often sounds or smells, and certainly her senses are kind of blended together. So she experiences the world in a really heightened way, which is often beautiful, but actually sometimes quite confused. And she talks about it being a bit of a muddle sometime in the novel. She also has a really very profound relationship with the landscape around her, with her home, and with one particular place, which is a sea spit, which in the novel is called the Snook. The Snook means the nose. And so for Ellen, this place, this very sort of sandy place, which when it's high tide is an island, is a really significant place for her, almost to the point of it being a sort of point of origin for her. She believes the family came from this place, in fact. Later on in the novel, she suffers from mental illness, which kind of develops as she moves into adulthood, and becomes worse when she becomes a mother. And it's for this reason that she's separated from her son. So Jack, her son, is born in the 1920s, and he doesn't know his real father. He has a stepfather. And Jack is a kind of difficult character. He spends most of the time being embarrassed by his rather eccentric mother, and his embarrassment is concretized by a particular event that takes place in the novel. And he never really gets over this. He never really gets over the shame of what happens, and also the guilt that he feels about his part in this particular event. And so he carries this embarrassment and this shame and this guilt with him into adult life. And it makes him a kind of a slightly inexpressive, slightly difficult, quite shy person, in fact. And one of the things that he can't understand about his mother is her deep sense of belonging to the town and the landscape. He hates the place. He wants to get away from it. And Jack, almost as a way of getting away from his hometown, he becomes a painter after the war, after the Second World War, and surprisingly has a certain amount of success in the 1950s, and becomes part of the London School of Painters. So people like Frank Auerbach and Lucian Freud. And so what's interesting is that Jack is dealing with color, albeit in a kind of material sense. He's dealing with color in much the same way that Ellen sees it and experiences it. And then there's a third character, which is the landscape itself. And I really wanted it to be a character. I wanted to write a novel of place. As I've said, the novel's set in the northeast of England. So you have to kind of imagine what the northeast looks like. I don't know whether that's possible, but it's very much a landscape of moors and cliffs. So it's kind of quite wild and quite rugged. And for the purposes of the novel, I invented my own kind of landscape, my own town. The town is called Teesby. So I sort of got rid of two real towns, which are Redcar and Saltburn, if anybody knows that part of the world. And I plonked my own invention down on top of them, and then invented this whole topography, a sort of elevated landscape. So there are points in the landscape when you're quite high up and points in the landscape where you're quite low down. This kind of seemed important to me because I wanted the characters to be able to move around the landscape and to look at things from different points of view. Again, it's this looking business that was quite important to me. And as I've said, for Ellen in particular, the sea spit, the snook, is a place that features quite largely, and it will feature largely in the extracts that I'm going to read. And this is the place where she feels particularly at home. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about this notion of home and belonging and how I might define it. I mean, I could have talked about painting in relation to the novel. I could have talked about mental illness in relation to the novel, but I chose home and belonging because for me, it's kind of central to the whole work, in a sense. It's what I'm really interested in, although it may not be particularly explicit to readers. And rather than spending time waffling through a definition of what I mean by home, I'm actually going to read something to you that I wrote for myself as a kind of definition of what I mean by home. And I wrote this about 4 or 5 years ago. So it's quite a personal text, but it's really this attempt to understand what I mean by home and what I mean by belonging. And as I say, I wrote this text for myself, but it ended up in my thesis. It ended up as the preface to my thesis. And I think, surprisingly, and my inner critic seems to agree with me, that this is actually quite a good definition. And for me, at least, it's quite a precise definition of what I mean by home. So I thought I would read it to you. The title of this preface is "That is How It Was, Coming Home, Always the Unexpected," which is a quote from a novel by the Irish writer John Banville. It's a quote from Birchwood, which was published in 1973. So I'm going to read this. It's just a page and a half long, so it's not too long. I'm not quite sure where home is. I envy that unequivocal sense of belonging that some of my friends and colleagues appear to possess. For 16 years, I have lived some distance from the country I occasionally think of as home, although I've developed an ambiguous relationship with England and notions of Englishness during this time. The place I currently call home is the French house to which I return at the end of the day. In this context, home signifies the spaces that I own, the spaces over which I think I have control. Home is private, yet it is also the view out of the windows. I gaze over a terrain that does not belong to me, but it is a landscape which is wholly familiar to me, a configuration of hills, trees, and barns that only I can see. My house, my garden, and my view are part of another anomaly. I have no connections to this particular part of the world. There is nothing that links me to this place or to this community. The location of my home was chosen carefully but dispassionately, a decision based on financial resources and proximity to a railway station. There are times, as I sit in my French house, when home is a mental image. A bungalow and a garden in the northeast of England, my earliest conception of home. While the bungalow is still standing, I can never return. For surely the concept of home contains within it a longing for a particular place at a particular time. In this sense, home is a memory rather than a set of spaces that one can simply wander into. As Gaston Bachelard suggests, I think back and I comfort myself by reliving memories of protection. Yet I know that my childhood home was not quite as I remember it, for home is not always so protected, not always so happy. Moreover, while I suppose I could declare myself a northerner, my connection to that region, that countryside, and those villages is tenuous. I have not returned home since I left 30 years ago, and I have no friends or family who live there. Home is not a fixed place. It shifts, it is fluid. Home is a sense of belonging that comes and goes. My decision to study at the University of Manchester coincided with a desire to come home. In this sense, my idea of home was closely associated with speaking English. I would be at home, albeit briefly, in a place where the inhabitants spoke my language. This return home, however, turned out to be an ambiguous experience. It was homely, it was unhomely. I found pleasure in the ease at which I could communicate swiftly and efficiently, but I felt awkward when I heard myself using a language in public that I only usually employ in the privacy of my own French home. In Manchester, the words and phrases I used sounded strangely stilted and sometimes false. This impression culminated in a singularly embarrassing incident, a stuttering of confusion, a momentary impression of being completely out of place, when for a few seconds, I did not understand my own language when it was spoken to me. As Gabriel Godkin, the narrator of Birchwood, declares, that is how it was coming home, always the unexpected. These anecdotes are a meandering and subjective first attempt to define the term home. It is a concept which oscillates between the private and the public, between the communal, shared language and shared values, and the specific, a particular geographical site that has personal residence, a location that represents a point of origin, perhaps. Okay, so there are 3 points, I think, that I just like to kind of pause on and develop a little bit more before I start reading from the novel itself. I think one of the things in the colours that I was interested in was the idea of home being a memory, almost a fantasy, and certainly a form of nostalgia. Nostalgia meaning longing for home. I think, if I remember rightly, and I'm not looking at my notes now, nostalgia was a word that was devised in the 1680s to describe homesick Swiss soldiers. So it's really, it really means longing to return home. And I think that's the particular condition that Ellen has, this longing to return, to this particular point in the landscape, this particular sandy sea spit. But I think there's also a certain amount of nostalgia in my own reasons for wanting to write about a family in the Northeast. And I haven't been back for 30 years, and I didn't do any research on the ground. I mean, I didn't go back. So for me, this is very much a kind of memory of the place. It's almost, to borrow a term from Salman Rushdie, it's almost an imaginary homeland. Rushdie talks about this in an essay called Imaginary Homeland, but obviously he's talking about India rather than Britain. The second point I think that's important is the idea of home being unhomely. And obviously Freud is kind of hovering around in the background. I'm not going to bring him into this, but certainly that idea of it being uncanny or unheimlich is quite important, particularly to the character of the son, to Jack, who's very much of an outsider who really doesn't fit in, and actually I think is quite happy not to fit in. And I remember reading a poem by Seamus Heaney called The Tollen Man, which is a poem about the mummified man that was found in the peat bog in Denmark, in Jutland. And Heaney writes about the Danish landscape, and then he conflates it with Northern Ireland. And then there are two lines. The last two lines of the poem are, "I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home," which I think is, it's not, I was going to say it's wonderful, it's not, it's kind of very melancholic in its paradox, that the lostness and being at home. But that those two lines really, for me, encapsulated Jack's relationship with his own home. And the third point, which I think is interesting, is the idea that home is some kind of mental refuge. So it's not a geographical space. It's not a domestic space. It's actually a mental state. So for me, in the text, I was talking about being able to speak my own language. Seamus Heaney also talks about it quite a lot in interviews as a kind of space of refuge, or I think he calls it a shelter at one point. And he's talking about writing, he's talking about poetry. And again, for my character Jack, painting is the space that makes him feel at home. It's the place that he can construct himself, and it's the place that he can control, albeit again momentarily. Okay, I'm gonna now move to the novel, and I'm gonna start reading some extracts. And I've tried to choose extracts from Ellen's point of view and from Jack's point of view. The novel kind of weaves together these two stories. And so a little bit like the characters moving around in the landscape, looking at the landscape from different points of view, the story also moves around and looks at events from different points of view. And often the same events are recounted in both stories, in both Ellen's story and in Jack's story. And also there's very much a sort of shift in time. Time moves backwards and forwards quite a lot in the novel. Although happily, this afternoon, I've managed to make it slightly chronological in my choice of extracts. So I've chosen 2 and a bit extracts for Ellen, which really describe this sense of belonging that she has in this particular place. So I'm going to start with her. And I'm going to start, I'm actually reading from the first chapter. And this is basically the first page of the novel. And happily, again, the first chapter is called Home. And the novel opens with 12-year-old Ellen effectively watching her father die. And then in the chapter, her home is slowly dismantled and she is taken away from home and put into care. So I'm going to read 2 short extracts from this chapter and then another short one from a little bit later on. Dar said the Pearson family came out of the sand. He said they were born out of the red, clarty sand that stuck to the soles of boots and the hems of frocks. On the beach, the women had deep frills of it round their skirts, so heavy it weighed them down. You couldn't just brush the sand away. You had to beat your clothes with the palm of your hand like you were smacking them for being naughty. You had to bang your boots against the doorstep and find a knife to gouge away the sand that clung to the heels and round the stitching. But however much you cleaned your clothes, it was always in the seams and the pleats and the pockets. It was in the bed too, trapped in the pillowcases and the folds of the sheets. On wash days, if you filled the basin with clean water and pushed your nightgown under the surface, the water turned pink straight away. And afterwards, when the basin was emptied, there was a sulky red sludge in the bottom and a hard skim of red round the rim. Teesby was covered in sand. It piled up in the streets and filled the cracks in the pavements and the gutters. It covered the front gardens and got caught in the long grass and the privet and the flower petals. When the wind was bad, the sand would swirl round your ankles, nip your legs and arms like a snappy dog. And when the waves were fierce, the sea would hurl fistfuls of it at the town. Then the faces of all the houses were spotted with soggy gobbets of dark red sand. Dar told Ellen that the sand blowing over Teesby came from the Snook. He said the Snook was a sea spit. The sea carried the sand in its waves, then spat it out in the same place year after year. When the tide was high, the Snook was an island and you would have to swim across the bay to reach it. But when the tide was low, you could get there by crossing the river and walking along the causeway over the marsh. Right at the end of the Snook was the tower. From a distance, it was a short, stubby thumb of a building against the pale grey sky. They built it to keep the Frenchies out, Dar said. That was a long time ago. If you climbed to the first floor, you could stick your head out of the window and look back at Teesby. From the tower, the town was just a dark-roofed cluster of small windowed houses that looked like they were trying to ignore the view. But the Snook was different. It was unpredictable, glowing in the sunshine, glowering in the rain. When Ellen was small, Dar had said that the Pearson family came from the Snook. They had pushed their heads out of the sand and levered themselves into the world with their brawny arms. Every Pearson had Snook sand running through their veins, Dar said, and Pearson blood was red, like the colour of the shore when the tide was low. Okay, so later on in the chapter, her father dies, and there is a funeral, and then this kind of horrible wake in this small terraced house in this sort of rather bleak coastal town. And Ellen has a brother who is slightly older than her called Henry, who is about 15 years old. So Henry's okay because Henry can look after himself. He's going to have a room in a boarding house and he already has an apprenticeship. But Ellen's future is very uncertain. It's possible that she's going to be looked after by a sort of distant relative called Aunt Minnie, who nobody really knows and has just turned up to help with the funeral. And so I'm going to read again another short extract, which I think develops this idea of the Snook being important to Ellen. So this is the wake. She found Henry in the hallway, leaning against the banister rail that was draped with the mourners' coats. He was biting his nails. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked. "You're to live with Aunt Minnie," he said, pulling his finger from his mouth. "And where are you going?" "Mrs. Veazey's boarding house on Marine Parade." "So I could come and live with you then?" "No, you can't," said Henry dully, pushing his hands into his pockets. Dar would have said, "Dar's not here." Ellen glared at Henry in his best suit and his new black tie. He was blank-faced and calm. His calmness smelt musty and mothy like the woolen coats behind him. She could see their creased, greasy collars and the sagging pockets filled with dirty handkerchiefs. Beyond them, she could see the brown flowered paper on the hallway walls and the linoleum floor that she had swept the day before Da died. She could hear someone clattering the dishes in the kitchen and Aunt Minnie's shrill sing-song voice echoing through the parlour door. "Cup of tea, Mrs. Pym? Milk? Sugar?" She despised the ordinariness of it all. Henry, the coats, the linoleum. It should have been a day that was far from ordinary. It should have been a day that was special. Something inside her began to lift its head, began to unwind. It spiraled upwards, knotting itself round her throat and her tongue before it spewed out of her mouth and into Henry's face. "I hate you," she spat at him. "I hate you all," she screamed at the coats and the clattering dishes and Aunt Minnie's piercing voice. She darted out of the house and along the street. The rain had stopped now. The sun was strong. As she ran, the sweat streamed down her neck and the heavy velvet funeral dress beat against her stockinged legs. She made her way towards the promenade, then sprinted over the sand to the river, weaving round the ice cream salesman and the donkeys, then dodging the noisy children with their buckets and spades. At the quayside, the little ferry boat was waiting to cross the estuary. As she stepped aboard, the boat lurched queasily down, then up again. It took only 5 minutes to cross the river, but by the time the boat had reached the opposite bank, Teesby was far away, just a heat-hazed huddle of buildings in the distance. The tiny half-dressed figures on the beach were silent now, their excited voices muffled by the breeze. Ellen began to trot down the road towards the causeway, sensing Da beside her, a ripple in the air, a shadow on the ground. If he could have spoken, he would have turned to her and said, "You should calm down now. Take a deep breath. Look at the view." He had said that to her after Ma died. They had stood together in the tower, looking out of the window at the sea. "Take a deep breath. Look at the view. Look at the view," she whispered into the breeze. The snook was just ahead of her, a wide red line, silty and pebbly and sandy, speckled with sea kale and storksbill. She stopped running, moved slowly, picking her way over the causeway, careful not to step on the washed-up crabs. Her anger was beginning to retreat. She could feel it settling down, curling up like a cat, resting but still alert, one eye open, one eye shut. On the snook, she skirted the clumps of yellow gorse that grew amongst the pebbles, then slid down a bank of shingle to the shore. There were heaps of driftwood on the sand, C-shaped tree branches, bark stripped and bleached, that had floated down the coast from Hartlepool and Sunderland. There were other treasures too, bits of rusted metal, fragments of china, buttons from the clothes of sailors who had drowned. She crouched down and found slivers of jet like black fingernails and shards of rose-pink quartz. She collected the stones, along with a few steel-coloured razor shells and periwinkles, and when her pockets were bulging and her hands were full, she made her way across the shingle to the tower before the sun disappeared behind the hill. Ellen returned to Teesby in the dark. The ferryman had already gone home by the time she reached the estuary. She had to walk a mile upstream to the swing bridge in order to cross the river. When she finally turned onto her street again, she could see them standing on the pavement. Henry stooping into the warm night and Aunt Minnie spinning this way and that. "Where have you been?" Aunt Minnie snapped as Ellen reached the front gate. "Everyone saw you tearing along the street. Everyone." Aunt Minnie was shaking Ellen by the shoulders, but Ellen didn't care. She was calm now. She watched the sand fly off her clothes. And I have just one more short Ellen section, which is very, very short, but I think it just sort of concludes it quite well. And this is Ellen as a grown-up. She's in her early 20s now, and again, she's on the beach, and she's a maid, but a fairly lonely person. I think she feels very lonely at this point. And she's managed to strike up a conversation with a man who's a lot older than her, who she calls, in her mind, the stone collector. And the stone collector is somebody who is searching for semi-precious stones and for fossils that he can sell, and also for pieces of jet. Because this is a beach that is near to Whitby. So if you know Whitby, you'll know it's famous for its jet. And so lots of jet that is washed up on the beach. So she struck up this conversation. And the conversation, I think for me, as the writer of this novel, this conversation was at the center of the novel in a sense. I mean, this is a real epiphany for Ellen. It's very important. This is the point at which that sort of origin story of the Pearsons coming out of the sand becomes true for her, in a sense. It's validated. They walked along the beach together, the stone collector staring at the sand, Ellen gazing at the view ahead. In the distance, she could see the snook and the tower. The tower was dark blue that day, a small, squat shape that appeared to be drifting on the sea. "Look," said the stone collector, bending down and picking something out of the sand. "A piece of jet. It's a decent size." He held it up for her to see. From a distance, the jet was pitch black, but when she looked more closely, she could see other colours in the blackness, green and brown and purple. The colours were singing to her. A faint chorus drifted from his fingers. "You wouldn't think it was just a stone," she said. "It's not a stone, it's a fossil." He dropped the jet into her hand. It felt warm and alive. Millions of years ago, there were pine trees all along the beach. When they died, they fell onto the sand and mixed with the seawater, and they gradually became fossils. Jets made from carbon, you see. Carbon? It's an element. It's everywhere. In the sun, the stars, in human beings even. So the stuff the jet is made from is inside me too? Yes. And the sand? Yes, beach sand has carbon in it. Things came together all at once, the things that Ellen could see. The old man on the quayside, hunchbacked over his nets, the bird skull washed up on a bank of razor shells, the dust on the stone collector's hat brim caught in the weak sunlight, his bony hand still gripping the piece of jet. All of them were connected. A wave ran up her body to her head, filling her brain. So Dar was right about the Pearsons coming out of the sand. They were the same as the sand. She was part of all this. Then the wave slowly descended again, and the thought faded away. And I have one last extract to read you, which is from Jack's point of view, which is a very different kind of experience, and very much an unhomely experience. And this extract is when Jack is 8 and 9 years old, so he's a small boy. And his mother's been taken into hospital, and she's been in hospital for about 6 months, and he's finally been allowed to visit her. I don't think he really wants to go, but he's finally being taken to see her by his uncle. And this extract's important. Again, I think there's a kind of epiphany happening here, because he realizes that his mother is not his mother anymore. She's a completely strange figure to him. So what represented home, albeit a slightly eccentric, unstable home, has suddenly disappeared, and that he is going to have to find a new home, which is what he does at the end of this section that I'm going to read. It took them almost an hour to reach the hospital. The Winterfield County Asylum had been built 80 years ago on a stretch of flat land close enough to the sea to be dusted by sand and for the grass to be tainted by salt, but too far away for anyone to be able to glimpse the sea or even smell it. The hospital formed part of Winterfield Village, although it was hardly a village at all, just a cluster of buildings divided by the main road. On one side were the high railings that enclosed the hospital grounds. On the other was a short terrace of brick houses that terminated at both ends in a shop. What struck Jack first, after he had stepped off the bus and followed Uncle Henry along the road to the asylum gates, was the symmetry of the place. He stood at the gates and gazed up the drive. The right side of the garden and the right side of the hospital was a mirror image of the left. Until then, every building and every landscape he could recall seeing had been asymmetrical. There was the undulating muddle of the villa on the hill, and the lopsided house on Invicta Road, its facade disturbed by the jutting bay window on the ground floor. Even the view from the beach was uneven. The snook on the left curved gently across the estuary, and the tower at its tip broke the horizontal line between the sea and the sky. When they reached the entrance to the hospital, 3 shallow steps and a wide stone portico, Uncle Henry stopped. He put his hand on Jack's shoulder and said quietly, "You have to remember, she might not be quite herself." It was as if he had only just thought of this. It was a hurried, slightly fearful remark. "People change, Jackie. You do understand, don't you?" Now Jack was dreading the visit even more. As they walked along the corridor, his heart was beating, pounding under his jumper. Thump, thump, thump. He pressed his hand hard against it to try and make it stop. She was sitting on a wooden bench in a long tiled room. She smiled faintly when she saw him in the doorway. She got up, stretched out her hand, and had held his limply for a moment. But Uncle Henry was right. She had changed. Like the hospital, his mother was symmetrical too. In Teesby, she had worn a brooch on the left lapel of her frock, and her hair had been swept across her forehead and pinned on one side with a silver clip. In Winterfield, however, she sat straight in her hospital clothes. Her hair was parted in the center and dressed evenly over each ear, and when she sat down again, she clasped her hands neatly in her lap. He waited, barely breathing, expecting her to say something about the day on the beach, but she was silent, as if she had forgotten it, or as if it hadn't happened at all. Uncle Henry handed her the diary, and Jack gave her the box of handkerchiefs. She laid the gifts carefully on the table beside her without looking at them. So kind," she said. "We thought they'd be useful," replied Uncle Henry gruffly. He took off his coat and wiped the end of his nose with a handkerchief. "So how are you feeling now?" "Very well. It's nice to have a good long rest." "So they're looking after you then?" "Very well." There was a long pause while they watched a group of visitors bundled in coats and scarves lean anxiously towards the nurse sitting at the desk near the doorway. Then Uncle Henry turned to Jack and touched his arm. "Tell your mother about school. I'm sure she'd like to know how you're doing." Jack was doing badly, and there was nothing else to say about school except the fact that he hated it. "We're reading Robinson Crusoe," he said finally. "When we've finished, we're going to read Gulliver's Travels," he said. "Lovely," she replied. "And he's doing his catechisms with Father Scullion," Henry chipped in. "So nice," she said, twisting her hands in her lap. It was like she was acting. She was playing the part so well that his real mother had almost disappeared, buried deep underneath the fake one. He wanted to find her again, grasp hold of her hands and shake them. He wanted to shout, "Ma, come back!" The conversation stumbled on for a few minutes more. Then his mother stood up abruptly, held out her hand as if they were guests she hardly knew, and said, "Do come again. I would very much like to see you both." Their second visit did not take place until long after Christmas. His mother was ill, Uncle Henry said. A touch of bronchitis, but nothing to worry about, nothing at all. She wasn't well enough to receive a visit until the first week of February. By then, the snowdrops were blooming in the front gardens of Invicta Road, but Winterfield Village was still frozen and the hospital grounds were barren. Jack's mother sat on the high-backed bench in the hospital parlour just as she had done before Christmas, and she was still symmetrical, apart from her right eye, which wandered independently of her left. The dilated pupil kept drifting to the edge of her eye socket as if she could see something in the corner of the room beyond Jack and Uncle Henry, something invisible to them both. She'd been given a rosary, a clumsy chain of wooden beads ending in a brown-stained cross, the sort that nuns wore hanging from a belt round their waists. She rubbed the beads between her thumb and finger and smiled at Jack, tentatively, uncertain of who he was. "Baby Kathy's starting to walk now," said Uncle Henry. "Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus," she replied, her fingers advancing along the beads. "Your Morris is working on the house near the villa again. You know the one, Nell, with the green railings, the house you used to like. He's wallpapering the hallway and the landing. They've chosen Anaglypta. Holy Mother, Mary of God." Uncle Henry was struggling to find anything more to say. After several false starts, he launched into, "Old Mrs. Rush is having all her teeth taken out. She's got a problem with the gums, costing her a fortune. Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen." Jack clenched his hands and pressed his nails into his flesh. It was easier not to look at her. Easier to gaze down at the floor, at the black and white tiles that looked like a drafts board. He stared at the checkerboard pattern, at the way it disappeared into the distance, at the way the squares turned into diamonds. Uncle Henry twisted his head and peered down at him. Then he reached out and squeezed Jack's shoulder. Jack could feel the faint warmth of his uncle's hand all the way through his jacket and shirt to his shivery skin. "I think we'd better be on our way," said Uncle Henry suddenly. "It's nice to see you doing so well." He was buttoning up his jacket and putting on his coat. "We'll come back to see you soon now, very soon." "Difficult day," said Uncle Henry when they stood in the shelter waiting for the Teesby bus. He shuffled his feet once or twice, then inhaled the frosty air. Finally, without another word, he walked across the road to the shop at the end of the terrace and appeared a few minutes later carrying a paper bag of barley sugar and a small, soft-covered book. He offered Jack a sweet and murmured, "She was a bit the worse for wear today, wasn't she?" Then he handed him the book, something to make up for it. Jack held the book loosely by his side. He didn't want to look at the gift in the chill shadow of the bus shelter, in the strew of sand and sweet wrappers. He didn't want to look at it on the bus either, and he gripped it tightly in his hand as they accelerated out of the village. He didn't want to sully this book with the memory of his mother's dancing eye. He didn't want this book, whatever it was, to be tainted by its association with Winterfield Asylum. He wanted it to belong somewhere else, beyond the limits of that dreadful frozen afternoon, beyond Teesby even. Without knowing its contents, he began to believe in the book's power, in its potential to catapult him out of Invicta Road, out of Teesby, far away from Winterfield. As he stared from the bus window and watched the landscape scroll behind his uncle's head, he transformed the poorly bound pages clasped in his sweaty hand into a talisman of sorts. Sitting on the settee in the cold front room, he examined the book. It was called The Modern World, a colouring book for boys. He had hoped for a story that might tell him something, that might help him forget the day, but this was just a book of drawings. There were no words, only black and white outlines, rough diagrammatic images of machines, buildings, and objects printed on thin fawn-coloured newsprint. He turned over the pages. There was a bridge, an aeroplane, a telephone, a tractor, a doctor inspecting a syringe. In the cubbyhole under the stairs was a cardboard box that contained a few of his books and comics. At the bottom was a tin of coloured pencils. Occasionally, he had taken a pencil out of the tin and pondered what to draw while he chewed the end. Whenever he put pencil to paper, however, he was always disappointed by the results. He could not make his drawing of Uncle Henry look like the real Uncle Henry, or the parrot look like the parrot, and he could not make his picture of the sun resemble the huge boiling spot in the sky that it really was. He unearthed the pencil tin and inspected the contents. There were only 4, black, red, yellow, and blue. He flicked through the book. There were 48 pictures in the modern world. The front cover showed a landscape, a wide river crossed by a railway bridge. A large ship was sailing underneath the bridge while a passenger train in the apple green livery of the LNER steamed overhead. In the distance, in a gentle valley between two rounded hills, a car tilted as it cornered a bend. And flying high above the title, in the top left-hand corner of the cover was a tiny glinting cross, a sleek, streamlined monoplane. When he turned to the first page, he found the faint outline of a biplane. He gazed at the convex arc of the plane's body and wondered what color it should be. On the cover, the monoplane was an unnameable shade between pale blue and silver. In the hope of reproducing the same mechanical gleam, he colored the entire picture using the blue pencil, careful not to escape the outlines. But when he held the book up and squinted at the page, the biplane was flat, just a silhouette of cobalt blue. He moved wearily to the next outline, a rough drawing of a stocky driver in overalls who was leaning against the door of his lorry. Overalls were brown. Jack knew this, khaki brown. Lorries were burgundy red because he had seen one driving towards the engineering works. But how was he to reproduce that scene using only 4 colors? In exasperation, he began to fill the voids lightly with all the colors in the tin until the driver and the lorry cab were covered in an iridescent scribble. He paused briefly, examined the drawing, then added more blue to the driver's overalls, following the printed lines that suggested the creases and the seams. Once again, he held the book up to his half-closed eyes, and this time he was perplexed. The forms stood out from the rest of the page. They had been thrown into relief against the black outlines and the blank spaces he had yet to color in. The driver's overalls appeared to ripple. He could see the folds and the wrinkles in the cloth, and the lorry cab shone like painted metal. He just performed a trick. He had transformed the picture of the driver and the lorry into something almost real. Okay, I think that's it from me.
Thank you so much for this very generous and elegant reading. Juliet, I mean, I must say from my experience with the book so far, I mean, see how colorful it is on the outside. It's that colorful on the inside as well. I mean, the characters are so full of color, they are so full of life, that, you know, it drives me to ask you, I mean, are these characters based on real people? Or did they just come up?
No, they honestly, they just came up. I mean, I think Jack's reticence and his hesitation is my reticence and hesitation. So I think he's got a fair bit of me in there. Ellen appeared out of nowhere, to be honest with you. And, you know, it's just one of those lucky things that sometimes the voice just comes straight away, that you don't really need to work at it in the way that you need to work at other things. And so she really just appeared. And obviously the synesthesia is a bit of a gift for a writer, because you can really kind of develop those interesting relationships between colors and sounds and smells and even words. So that worked very well for me. But yeah, I mean, I think Jack is me. Jack is me and my father a little bit, and Ellen. I have no idea who Ellen is. But they were, yeah, they're all invented. They're not based on anybody apart from me. There you go.
That's incredible. It really is, because you get the feeling that these people, I mean, they are real in the story, but you kind of gave them a life of their own, and the synesthesia sort of tops things off. It gives it a feel of a feast of the senses, if you want.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And but I think for her that's precisely how she feels, but it's also a terrible, terrible confusion for her too. To live your life in such a heightened way is also a bit tiring, I think, at times. Mm-hmm. And so she finds a kind of calmness on the snook that she doesn't find in other places. Things kind of come together for her there. But I have to add, I mean, just to say that I think, were they based on real people? I think I would have found that really difficult. I mean, I think the advantage of making things up is actually that you can make things up and you can go where you want. So you're not kind of constrained by trying to be true to something, in a sense. I don't know how writers can write about real figures, historical figures. I admire that greatly, but I don't know how they can do it, because I would always feel sort of constrained by the truth, in a sense. Whereas this is, it's fiction.
Right. Well, thanks again for everything wonderful that you've said and read so far. I'm going to leave the floor to the rest of the audience. I will ask you to either post your questions and comments in the chat box, or you may just use the microphone, use the raise hand button, and then we can call on you to ask. We already have a comment by Serene Cortaz. Serene says, a very elegant reading and interesting story. So
thank you very much.
And if there's anyone else, I would just set it on gallery view so I could see the raised hands if anyone else has a question or a comment to give. Okay. Right, we have a question from Miriam Sette. Miriam asks, you mentioned Defoe and Swift. Are these two authors a source of inspiration for you?
Not at all, actually. Not at all. I just remember my own childhood. I remember being at school, at primary school, and those stories being read to us. So I just took my own experience and put it into the novel. Having said that, and having reread Robinson Crusoe when I was an adult, I actually think it's really interesting. And in a sense, it fits perfectly with the theme of home and belonging, because Crusoe is constructing his own home from scratch. So while it was just a passing thing for the colors, I actually, Crusoe was actually quite an important, it was something that I was reading for my thesis. And I was reading, this is going off the point slightly, but my thesis was based on 3 novels. One of them was Jane Gardam's Crusoe's Daughter. I don't know whether anybody knows that, but if you do like Robinson Crusoe, read Jane Gardam's Crusoe's Daughter, which is a novel about a character who becomes obsessed with Robinson Crusoe because he's shipwrecked. And that was the reason why I reread Crusoe. And as I say, the idea of home is actually central to that work. So there you go.
Thank you. We have another question by Dr. Alan Hickman. Did you have to do much research for the book? If so, where did you do it?
Okay, research is a funny thing, because you kind of get into it, and research is a great excuse for not writing fiction, because you have to read and you have to do your research, and then suddenly when you start writing, you realize the research again is kind of constraining you, and so you have to sort of push it away. So it's a very strange relationship that I have with research. I think something that I did a lot of was visual research. So I was looking at lots of pictures, and I think that helped me a great deal. So pictures of the beach, pictures of the Northeast, pictures of clothes, what people would have looked like in 1912 or 1923 or 1931, pictures of cars, all that sort of stuff. So I kind of had a sketchbook full of images that I basically found on the internet. And then I did some research. There's a point at which Jack is in the RAF, so I did do some research there about he makes models in the RAF. He makes models of areas that are potential bombing sites, which is something that existed during the war. There was a whole group of men in a basement near London making models of bits of Germany and France and Holland, and these were given to the RAF and used by the pilots to help them find the sites to bomb. And so I did research on that. And I did, I mean, one of the reasons why I enjoyed sort of writing about the royal wedding in 1981 was that I actually spent probably 2 or 3 days just watching the video of Prince Charles and Princess Diana getting married and sort of describing it in rather with a sort of slight sort of tongue in my cheek. And so it was that sort of research that I did. I didn't go back. I didn't go back to the Northeast. I didn't want to go back to the Northeast. I didn't think I needed to. The Northeast I was writing about is not the Northeast of 2016 or 2017. I had actually planned to go back after writing the novel, which of course hasn't happened. So yeah, it's kind of, I mean, everything for me either happens from reading books or, I mean, I have to say the internet is a great resource for a writer, but most of the research was sort of visual, I think.
Hey, thank you. We have a comment from Anastasia Bakal. Anastasia says, thank you for this wonderful story. We have a question by Carol Mora. Carol says, I love the juxtaposition of the sense of the textual image and the visual image. This reading has been wonderful and look forward to actually reading the book. I wonder if you might speak about this aspect of the image and perhaps its relation to the concept and image of home and homeland. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not quite sure that, could you just read the last bit again with the question?
Okay. I wonder if you might speak about this aspect of the image and perhaps its relation to the concept and image of home and homeland.
Okay. Gosh, right. Yeah, I think, okay. I mean, I think for me, everything, when I'm writing, I see the writing as images. I guess other writers do that. I don't know. I don't really talk to many other writers apart from a few in France. But for me, the visual is something that's really important. And so I guess in some ways I'm a kind of frustrated filmmaker. So I imagine a scene so I can see the people and I can see where they are. And I can see what they're wearing, and I can imagine the landscape that's around them. And I think that yes, I'm not quite sure. It's difficult to talk about images and its relationship to home. I think that's all part of it in a sense. I mean, I think in both cases, home for Ellen is represented as this sort of sandy, sort of sandspit, this sort of coastal space which is almost womb-like for her. It's, as I say, it's a sort of point of origin. It's where she wants to return to. And for Jack, the image of home is painting. And so there are scenes in the novel. I think there are scenes in the novel. I can't remember whether they're still there or not. But there should be scenes in the novel where home becomes the actual activity of putting paint onto the canvas. I mean, it's actually a process rather than an actual place. It's actually an activity rather than an actual place. So in a sense, that's very visual as well. And something that happens to Jack, again, talking about images and home, something that actually happens to Jack towards the end of the novel is that he begins to paint pictures of home, which is why I called the talk Pictures of Home. He actually unconsciously, without even realizing, he starts to paint pictures from his childhood of the homes that he's remembered. So again, that's a sort of visual representation of home in a sense. I hope I've answered the question.
Thank you so much, Juliet. We have more comments. We have a comment from Nidhi Varkour. Nidhi says, thank you so much for a wonderful time. From Pamela Shrabiye, Pamela says, thank you for the beautiful story, inspiring. Anna Lambri says, so inspiring and elegant, thank you. And Leslie Gardner, what inspired this particular story? Was there a real event that caught your imagination?
Leslie, right, okay. Well, okay, here is the story behind the story, which I actually haven't said to anybody because I don't think it's particularly relevant. I come from a family with a father who never ever talked about his family. He was very tight-lipped about them, and I didn't know them. In fact, they'd actually died before I was born, but he never spoke about them. We didn't have photographs of them in the house, absolutely nothing. So I didn't really know where he came from. I mean, I knew he'd got parents at some point, and I sort of knew he had a sister. And just before I started to write the novel, actually, I have to say it coincided with my mother dying as well. So actually I started writing the novel at the point that my parents had died, which I think is kind of interesting because I think the novel, there's a lot of loss in there in a sense. And I think talking about inheritance as well was something that was preoccupying me, certainly at the beginning when I started to write this in 2012. And I started to do some research about my father. And my father's family, and I actually didn't find very much, it wasn't very interesting, but discovered that for example, that his sister had died of TB aged 18 in 1948, which I found tragic that he'd never talked about this. And I suddenly wanted to sort of fill in the gaps. So in a sense, the family in my novel becomes my own family. So Ellen is the grandmother that I never knew, effectively. And as I said, Jack is a bit me and is a bit my father. And there is a daughter in the book who is the same age as me. So it's a complete fantasy. I don't know anything about my grandmother. I'm fairly certain that she didn't go into a mental institution. I think she actually died in the 1930s of pernicious anemia or TB. I have to say that tuberculosis is something that features in the novel, although I don't think I ever actually name it, which is one of the diseases that is actually inherited. And my father also had TB, so that's the whole thing there. So I think, Leslie, it's a family, it's plugging the holes, if you like. It's plugging the gaps in my knowledge about my own family, and I sort of invented it. Although they don't actually come, my family don't come from this part of the world, which is sort of more or less near Middlesbrough, for anybody who knows Britain. They come from Northumberland. So they're a family from Alnwick, the Bateses of Alnwick. So if there are any Bateses from Alnwick out there, I guess we're probably related in some way. There you
go. That's very interesting. We also have a comment from Carol Mora, following up on your answer to her question on images. I'm very sorry if this question was too involved. I just very much noticed this juxtaposition of the visual image and the textual image that, for me, set them and their difference into an interesting kind of relief. Okay. And yes, the excerpt with Jack brought this question to mind.
Right, okay, good.
And I think we have some more. Yes, Alan Hickman, you have a ton of books. Which contemporary writers are there?
Okay, yeah, the ton of books, and there are more upstairs. Okay, contemporary writers. You know, I have to be honest, I'm not great with contemporary writing. Although, I guess it's not contemporary. At the moment, I'm going through a Penelope Fitzgerald stage. So I'm reading The Beginning of Spring by Penelope Fitzgerald, and I have another one by Penelope Fitzgerald that I'm planning on reading. I think she's an interesting writer. On my desk upstairs, for various reasons, is Ian McEwan's Atonement, and a few other ones that I can't actually remember now off the top of my head. So yeah, contemporary, yes, this is embarrassing. That's the best I can do. Fitzgerald is dead now, so that's not great. I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. My partner has a 20-year rule, which is very bad, I think, really. He says he waits 20 years to find out, whether they're any good, and then he'll read them when they're 20 years old.
Fair enough.
He read mine, so I'm okay. But I don't have that rule, but it just so happens that I do a lot of reading, and I guess this maybe feeds back into that question to do with the research. A lot of my reading actually is reading that's related to what I'm writing about. So, for example, on my pile of books here, I've got Harold Nicholson's Diaries, which I'm reading because I'm interested in the 1930s and the sort of politics of the 1930s. So it's that sort of reading that I do. which might be fiction, or it might be non-fiction, which is often related to the history of the 20th century in many ways, I think. There you go. So that was a complete cop-out, I think, the contemporary thing. Sorry about that. It's a confession.
We also have a question by, a comment by Miriam Sette. Miriam says, Plato in Book 10 of the Republic define the artist as the recreator of the entire universe.
Absolutely, yes. And I think most artists think they are. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's good. I think Jack certainly thinks he is. Yes, that's true.
And Leslie says,
actually, it had to do with the Leslie. It was a comment to Leslie Gardner question.
Right,
So anyway, thank you for your answer.
yes, and Leslie says, goes back to writing what you know, even metaphorically.
Okay.
So, is there anyone else who would like to ask or comment? You have been very patient with all the questions and answers, and you just discovered that you don't read contemporary fiction.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which is great. I mean,
I brought contemporary in quotation marks because I'm 70 years old. My contemporaries are
Right. Okay. Yes.
30 or
Okay.
40
Yes.
years.
Contemporary is 70 years old. That's good. Yes, I agree with you. That's good. Yes, I'm happy with that definition.
I mean, when I first read Juliet myself, she's a contemporary writer.
Yeah.
Juliet Bates is.
But, I don't feel very contemporary, Leslie.
Well, I'm reading books that people are hoping to get published. So
Right.
they're pre-contemporary, I suppose you'd say, because I'm working with writers who are, but what it does mean is I sometimes miss out the time to read a Sally Rooney or who's very big in this country, or but then I love spending time reading Middlemarch.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it's and finding the Ardana Tart, who writes very extensively. I feel like she was writing in the 19th century practically. She's that kind of writer. But no, it's my contemporary writer was Juliet Bates. So,
right. Okay. Oh, well, that's nice. Thank you. Yeah, right.
Who you should all read. She's a solid contemporary writer. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of Graham Swift and Rose Tremaine and Pat Barker, people like that. They're my contemporaries.
Well, Graham Swift was very important to me. As is Banville. Why didn't I think of Banville?
Banville's wonderful.
Yeah. And also, I mentioned Jay Gardner already, but for me, Banville in particular, and Swift. I mean, something like Waterland, for example, was very important for me in terms of the way in which Swift writes about landscape. So yes.
I wrote my dissertation on Swift.
I wrote my thesis on Swift.
Well, that was 40 years ago. Yeah. Something in common. But Banville, I've forgotten about him. Hadn't read him.
He's wonderful.
The
Untouchable.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love The Untouchable. Yeah. But actually, The Untouchable is kind of not like the other ones.
It's a spy novel, really, isn't it? Kind of a Cambridge spy group or something.
Yeah. It's Anthony Blunt. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful session. I'm sure everybody had such a great time hearing the excerpts from your novel and a few backstories here and there. So again, Juliet, we're very honored to have you with us today. And we're greatly looking forward to your new novel, your next novel, which we hope will come out sometime soon. And I'd just like to show the cover of The Colors again. It's such a beautiful cover. I mean,
gorgeous cover. And the paperback is out very soon. Yeah.
It's just beautiful. And I tried to dress up to the occasion by, wearing the most colors that I could find around the house. So again, thank you so much. And we look forward to your forthcoming work. And hopefully we'll have you with us again at some point.
Yeah, it was lovely, Rula. Thank you very much
for
inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank the wonderful audience for being here today.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.